This is the last teaching before the crucifixion sequence in Matthew. Listen now for a word from God. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they also will answer, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?' Then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.' And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I thought what we'd do today, do something maybe a little bit differently. I'm interested to hear from you, what were one or two very influential books in your life, or influential books in your life presently? Books that you have read and reread, books that have been formative to you. What would some of those be? Paula?
You asked about formative. The Dick and Jane series in elementary school. I loved those. I was so disappointed when we graduated and I think second grade not reading books.
You never found out what happened with Dick and Jane? Because they seemed like, were they brother and sister?
Oh, yes.
Okay, good, because I was about to say you never found out if they got together, but that would have been... Oh, wow. Well, a lot of family dynamics going on there. Okay. Other books that were formative to people? Not a Fan. Yeah, that's an important book. It's called Not a Fan. You'll have to ask Brenda about it later. Yeah, Georgia? Heidi, yeah. Other books? Wyatt? Quiet? Oh, Quiet. I'm surprised you said that out loud. What is the subtitle of Quiet? Something like How to Deal with an Annoyingly Loud World Full of Extroverts, or something like that. It's a great subtitle. Other books that are meaningful or formative? Russell? Oh, Robinson Crusoe? All right. Russell, what were you going to say? Flowers for Algernon, yeah. The Shack, yeah. What's that? Anne Frank. Well, Where the Red Fern Grows. I read that in 7th grade, yeah. I think the most earliest, the first book that was most formative to me was Shel Silverstein's Where the Sidewalk Ends. We had to read that in 4th grade, and it was the first book I read all the way through. And I still remember looking at all the funny pictures in the book and reading the funny words. I could never quite square the joy in that book with the picture on the back cover of a man who looked like a homicidal maniac. I just assumed that was like the publisher who was unhappy about how it worked out or something. I didn't think that was actually the author, but it was. I read that book and I loved it, and I have a friend who teaches in fourth grade, and I've been able to inflict that book on other generations of students, which brings me great joy. I accidentally memorized a poem from that book called Beard. And then there's a little funny picture of a man with a long beard, and it goes with the poem. And the poem says, my beard grows down to my toes. I never wears no clothes. I wraps my hair around my bear, and down the road I goes. I'm really sorry that I have memorized that poem. I really wish I could memorize other poems. Like, I still have this vision in fourth grade, Mrs. Back's fourth grade class, of Jennifer Baird standing in front of the class with her curly blonde hair and these really big pink, like, petal glasses, and she's reciting how to make a hippopotamus sandwich. I don't know that one, but I still can see her kind of shaking and reciting that poem. 6 or 7 years later, I was in Miss Worm's English class, and I was not doing very well because I had been talking instead of doing my daily reading. And I needed to make an A+ on the final in order to get a C in the class. And what was standing between my current grade and the grade I wanted was all 800 pages of John Steinbeck's East of Eden. And if you don't know East of Eden, it's John Steinbeck is struggling with his own family, his family of origin issues, and he's able to kind of work that out as he writes this book. And he also struggles with violence and our human tendency toward violence. And he kind of recasts Genesis chapter 4, the struggle of Cain and Abel, in the generations of his family, and asks questions like, do we have to repeat the same mistakes that our grandparents have made? Does Cain have to kill Abel in each generation, or can we overcome violence? Can we overcome sin? Those were very heavy questions. I was more interested in the question, can Michael McCormack overcome his tendency to sit on the couch after school and watch TV and listen to early 90s hip-hop? Or can he read 65 pages a day, because that's what it's going to take in order to read the whole book by the time the final comes around? Well, the answer to that question was yes. Yes, I could, and I did. And I did get a fine grade. But more importantly was I discovered an author who would become my friend in a way. I love John Steinbeck now. He's great. Those books became kind of friends to me. Now, when I was in seminary, I read a lot, probably more than 65 pages a day, and my glasses got thick. And as I went on in my education, one of my professors called me into his office and said, you know, Michael, if you can write kind of good, I'm sure that's exactly what he said, if you can write kind of good, people will pay you for it. And I was like, oh? And he said, yeah, there's a fellowship, and if you will write a 40-page paper and you win this fellowship, you'll get $4,000. And I said, sign me up. And so I began doing research and studying in order to write this fellowship. And I came across a book. I had already bought it at a book sale for 50 cents, but my professor wanted me to read it. It was The Meaning of Revelation by H. Richard Niebuhr. And I read a passage, and it stuck with me, and I ended up reading the book twice. But it's a tremendous passage. I want to share it with you. I've shared it with you before, but I'm going to read it again. We can imagine, Niebuhr says, we can imagine that early preachers were often asked to explain what they meant with their talk about God, salvation, and revelation. And when they were hard-pressed, when all their parables and references to the unknown God and to the Logos had succeeded only in confusing their hearers, they turned at last to the story of their life, saying, what we mean is this event which happened among us and to us. And he's referring to this event being Jesus. When I read those words and when I continued to read Niebuhr, I found not only a book that could be a friend, but I found a viewpoint that could be like a home, like a place, a world in which to live. It was amazing. We read books and reread books. We recite certain books around the holidays. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even my brother. We read books, we read words, and yet there are words that read us. There are words that are challenging, but they challenge us and push us. And I can't think of a better example of that than Matthew 25, the passage we read today. Now, all of Matthew 25 is challenging and pushes us. At the beginning, we have the parable of the wise and foolish virgins that teaches us to be prepared as we await for the coming of the King. And then we have the parable of the wise and foolish servants that teaches us to act faithfully as we wait. And now we don't really have a parable as much as we have sort of a glimpse of the coming King as he comes to judge the nations. And Jesus is the King, only he comes as a king and a shepherd, and he separates the sheep and the goats. The shepherds would separate them at the end of the day, but now at the end of history, the king who is the shepherd separates them. And he says to the sheep, "You have served me. When I was hungry, you gave me food. And when I was a stranger, you welcomed me." And all the other things he says. And to the goats, he says, "You didn't do those things to me." And both groups are shocked that they did and didn't do things for the king. They say, "When? When did we do this stuff? We have no idea. If we'd known it was you, we would have dressed nicer and been on our best behavior." But Jesus says, when you fed the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you fed me. When you didn't visit the prisoner in jail, you didn't visit me. The power of this parable is in that reversal. That however we treat the least of these, our brothers and sisters, that's how we treat Christ. That's the power. We'd like to take away that power if we could and soften this. And some commentators try to do that and say, no, in the original hearers, the least of these would have been the first generation of missionaries. And the nations are being judged about how they treated the first generation of missionaries. But I think that gets it inside out. Because the power of this parable is that we know who the least of these are. We know who they are. When we read this, we can see them. The issue is, do we believe that how we treat them is how we treat Jesus? And if so, how do we begin to live out a faith where we seriously feed the hungry and clothe the naked and feed and give water to the thirsty and all the things that's mentioned? How do we do that? Since we're being participatory today, by a show of hands, don't raise your hands now because you don't know what I'm going to say, but how many of you go to the doctor once a year for a physical? How many of you do that? Maybe your insurance company has an incentive and they give you a cookie in the mail if you do it, or maybe they even pay for you to go. And so when you go, I go in July, that's the time when I have to face the music. I go in July and they always weigh you, never let you take your shoes off, which I think is kind of a crock. They're not. Science must not be very strong for them. I mean, yeah, flip-flops, that's right, in a linen suit or something. And so they do that, and then they take your blood work, right? HDL, LDL, blood glucose, cholesterol, all that good stuff. They're trying to figure out how healthy you are. And it's not that you're either healthy or not healthy. It's a range, right? They never come in and they say, good news, your cholesterol is 0. Or the reverse, they would never come in and say, we took your cholesterol numbers and it's actually full. It's all cholesterol. That's all it is. They never do that. It's always a range. Well, I think Matthew 25 is sort of diagnostic like that. It's a way for us to take the health of our own faith and the faith of our congregation. So it's almost like it's a diagnostic tool, almost like an essay. How are you involved with feeding the hungry? Describe. How are you involved with giving water to the thirsty? Describe. Describe any incidences of you visiting or welcoming the stranger or visiting those in prison. Describe. And so we're able to read this, and as we read it, it reads us, and it asks us how we're doing. Now, as a congregation, when I look at this list, I think that in the area of clothing the naked, we're up like 1,000%, because we've been very serious about the clothing closet all year. We've increased our hours. We thought that was going to increase the volume of clothes going out. It did, but it also increased the volume of clothes coming in. And it's like a river of corduroy sometimes, but we're helping. We're helping those who need it. People know about us now, and they tell their friends, and more people know, and you've been good to volunteer. And we've really increased our ministry in that area. And that's a good thing. And there's other ways that we can increase our ministry across the other 5 categories. And that's good. I mean, Elizabeth's great idea about the selfless selfies. I hope you'll take advantage of that, you that have smartphones or just regular old flip phones that people crush under their boot in bad movies. But you can take a picture with it, right? Take a picture with you and someone else doing something good. We don't have to judge them, which was Noah's idea. I'm sure he's already got a prize structure worked out. But we want to have fun and share and remember that we're getting into the time of year where we want to live out our faith in a public way, amongst ourselves at least, to remember to serve the least and the lonely and the lost. Because as we do that, we serve Christ. We serve Christ himself. The last thing I'll say is that whenever I come across this passage, I always think of a book that they assigned us to read, and it was like 21 years ago. My first class in college, it was an introductory English class. And we read books like Fahrenheit 451, which I promptly burned afterward, because I thought that Ray Bradbury would appreciate that. And I think Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant by Ann Tyler, which was a fun book. But the book that I keep thinking of, and I had to buy another copy of it because I had given it away, was a little book by Clyde Edgerton called Walking Across Egypt. And I keep thinking of this, and I talk about it every time I preach this passage. I try not to, but I just have to talk about it. Because it's a terrific example of one woman struggling with what it means to live out Matthew 25, specifically to visit those in prison. Maddie Rigsby is probably 80. And she feels like she's slowing down. A dog has been coming around her property, and she knows she's too old to keep a dog. But then when the dog catcher comes and she talks to him and she hears about the dog catcher's nephew who's in prison, those words from Matthew 25, they get at her. They read her life. And she knows that she needs to visit Wesley at the juvenile detention center. Toward the end of the book, she begins to really struggle with whether she should or shouldn't become his guardian. And let me just read you a little passage right before she decides. This is what it says. Sitting on the couch with the legal papers in her lap, the lamp lighted beside her, she closes her eyes and prayed, "Dear Lord, bless this house and all I try to do. Guide and protect me in making this decision. Help me to do what's right. What if everybody did good unto the least of these?" thought Maddie. What in the world would happen? But I'm not young anymore, able to take on this, that, and the other. It's getting harder just to keep up with this house. I need to look after myself, do a good job of that. I owe that to myself. I can't take care of some boy who's liable to do no telling what. Dear gentle Jesus, guide me in making this decision. I need to get it over with. Decide now. Please guide and direct me. In thy precious name, amen. My prayer for us is that as we enter into this time of waiting, that we might, like Maddie, we might make a decision each day to serve the least and the lost and the lonely. And by serving those, we might realize that we're serving Christ. Amen.